to get to know a little bit about you as an audience. We've got about 80 folks so far on the call, so I'm going to put up this first poll. So now asking about your company. Your company has received a rating of what on the last Corporate Equality Index? And click on your answer and hit submit, and you'll be able to see the results of the audience. And we get a great graph in there. So we see that looks like right now about 60% of the audience gotten 90 to 100%, about 5% 70 to 89, 40 to 69, 8.6. We've got some that don't. I've got about 3% don't participate in the CEI. You might not know what your company has, about 14%, and not applicable if your company fall under the Corporate Equality Index, or you're self-employed, or not working for a company at this time. So we'll give everybody, I've got about 75% of the attendees have responded to the poll. I'll give you just a few more seconds to get your. And again, we have callers calling in from all over the world and all different sectors and business. So let me go ahead and start our second poll here. And are you involved in submitting the CEI within your company? Select all that apply. Again, no, you just know the score. You can hit submit and see the answers. Not no, and I don't know if we do it or not. Yes, you're part of the compiling the ERG information or working with HR. You're an executive sponsor, that you do it from a legal perspective. So options there about how you're involved with the Corporate Equality Index. And hopefully, if you have not heard of that before, this will be a great call for you to be able to learn about that and find out what. But just another couple of seconds to fill that out and make sure that. All right, so it looks like the highest we've got is that you work with your ERG, about 31%. But close to that, you just know your score and you're not involved. And then the next two batches is no, I don't know if we do it or not, and yes, you compile the HR data. Good, we've got almost everybody. We're up to about 96 participants now on the call. So with that, we've got a little background and understanding, and that may help Dina to be able to for comments and questions. So again, these are our highest rated workshops at the summit, so we make sure that we get the opportunity to hear from these presenters, not only live at the summit, but also live on our webinars. So with that, Dina, I'll turn it on over to you, and you're ready to go.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Pat, and thank you to everybody for joining. So as Pat said, I probably have met many of you in person, or at least been in touch with you, or my team has. If after this recording, in addition to engagement you have with Out and Equal, if you ever want to be in touch, we are at CEI@hrc.org. Again, it's CEI@hrc.org. And so it's been now going on about 2 years since we initially made this announcement, so we're hoping that this is not the first time you're hearing about the new criteria changes. But it's never too late to start, at least in terms of this still being ahead of the April 1st window for this year's Corporate Equality Index. So with that, I think I just want to quickly recap the CEI in terms of the actual criteria timeline. So for those of us, or excuse me, for those of you who have been with us over this journey since 2002, you probably know, and this may even be the 14th edition of the index that you'll be working on, but the Corporate Equality Index began in 2002, and we do not take changes lightly. In fact, we're quite careful and have a very long vetting process in terms of hearing back and having a lot of dialogue with our corporate partners, meaning all of you, those that take the Corporate Equality Index. We get feedback from all swaths of the LGBT and advocacy community. And we pull this together to ensure that our criteria changes really are reflecting best-in-class practices, that we're keeping a pace with what our best companies are doing, and that we're maintaining a scorecard that is in fact fair and attainable for the entire population of companies in the Corporate Equality Index. And so just to quickly review, we have revised the scorecard only 4 times, including this recent set of updates announced for 2016. So in between 2002 and 2006, we revised the CEI scorecard to enumerate and include transgender-inclusive benefits. We also expanded our listing of domestic partner benefits to, again, reflect best-in-class practices where many companies initially, and I should say companies and law firms, initially extended healthcare benefits to same-sex partners of employees. This was to better look at the entire suite of benefits, both healthcare and also soft benefits, retirement benefits, family leave benefits, and so forth. We also were generally raising the profile of the needs of transgender workers, and so that's the year that we also started to evaluate things like gender transition guidelines and supportive trainings to really start to make those gender identity non-discrimination policies real. And the next time that we had fully changed the criteria, so apart from the original criteria, was headed into the 2012 Corporate Equality Index. And that was the year that we went to full transgender-inclusive benefits, in other words, full baseline coverage, completely eliminating the exclusions to transgender health care coverage, and subsequent to that, actually affirming care. We also looked at full parity. In other words, the gold standard was not a partial credit, but full parity across all domestic partner offerings. We added the category of organizational competency. So based on feedback from our companies, from the community, we knew that companies really needed to give structure to implementing their policies, so actually having accountability metrics for senior leaders. Certainly ERGs have been an important part of the CEI journey, but beyond just ERG membership, many companies started to implement what's commonly called optional self-identification, and that was certainly a great collaborative initiative that Out and Equal led with us and with some other companies to have a best practices teaching group on that. And lastly, we expanded the public commitment category. The two places that we've seen just dramatic increases over the last few years would be LGBT Supplier Diversity Initiative with our friends and collaborators at the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, certainly expanding their reach with you, the major employers, and providing that pipeline of LGBT-owned businesses to your supply chain management. And also, if you've read a paper or watched the news in the last couple of years, you've seen a dramatic increase with the extent to which businesses are weighing in on LGBT public policy, so marriage, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and so forth. And so this represented a fairly complex and diverse set of revisions headed into 2012. And, it shouldn't be glossed over that the first year that we had that revised criteria in 2012, our number of businesses with that top rating went from over 300 to just 189. And here we are, it's calendar year 2015. The prior Corporate Equality Index that came out in November demonstrated that we've actually now reached the highest record number of 100% rated businesses ever in the history of the Corporate Equality Index, with 366 top-rated businesses. So we're confident that even if the overall number of top-rated businesses is lower in the first year of a new criteria standard, we're actually quite confident that many other businesses that perhaps were in at an 80 or a 90 will look at their industry peers, will reach out to HRC and get to that 100. But it certainly is our hope, and efforts like this are aimed at keeping our number of 100%ers and even growing that list. So with that, I want to review the now fourth edition and counting of the CEI criteria. And the criteria is at a glance. As I mentioned, the last set of revisions were fairly complex and got into the nuances of benefits enrollment, of benefits availability, of organizational competency. And in many ways, you could view this revision to the criteria as a return to some core elements of LGBT equality in the workplace. And the rationale behind each three certainly comes from a diverse set of issues, but it's, if you walk away with this call, if you walk away with nothing else from this call, just remembering that we're talking about 360 degrees of non-discrimination. So how are the principles of non-discrimination evidenced across three key business operations? And that would be a global workplace non-discrimination policy and or code of conduct, inclusive non-discrimination requirements for contractors and vendors, and corporate giving guidelines that prohibit centralized corporate funding of organizations such as the Boy Scouts of America that have a written policy of discrimination against the LGBT community. So again, this is the slightly, so we went from at a glance to the 30-second digest version. We also wanted to be clear here that the first aspect of the criteria change is aimed at multinational businesses. So that's currently, as we'll discuss a little bit later on this webinar, 2/3 of our businesses. The following two are aimed or will be graded on U.S. only. We feel that it would be too much too soon to, over 24 months, have a complete metric system around international supplier codes of conduct and also the international chain of corporate giving. So that's that part of the Corporate Equality Index that is aimed at being both aspirational but also fair and attainable given the timelines that we're all working with. And a quick recap in terms of where we are. For those of you on pins and needles, the new Corporate Equality Index will be sent out on April 1st of this year. And the name of that index is, of course, the 2016 Corporate Equality Index Survey. That survey will be due back to HRC August 1st. And then in fall 2015, the new scoring takes effect. So prior to you filling out the Corporate Equality Index, we will have the mock-up of your scorecard based on the information you'd previously given us. And then we will be working with you over the course of this year to fill in any gaps or modify policy language. You can view all of the changes to the Corporate Equality Index at this website, hrc.org/2016 CEI, and that's where you can download the criteria updates and toolkit for success. And that toolkit includes a longer explained version of each criteria change, but also commonly asked questions and other helpful tips, as well as data points for how many other businesses are already doing this. Okay, so first, let's go to global policies. First off, it's important to note that we have actually been collecting information on an optional basis only to date on global policies within the Corporate Equality Index since 2004. So we've had about a decade of data under our belts. We've looked at the fairly consistent rates at which businesses have opted in and said, yes, we have made our own non-discrimination policy global. In other words, the non-discrimination policy that we submit for credit in the U.S. Corporate Equality Index is actually the exact same policy that all of our employees must abide by globally. In addition, we've seen the rise of the Global Code of Conduct. So for some businesses, standard U.S. EEO language, it's not desirable to simply replicate that across global entities, but instead to develop a comparable and no less effective, but a comparable code of conduct that speaks more to their global workforce without as much of a U.S.-centric slant. And so in terms of the rationale here, sexual orientation and gender identity employment protections are just natural extensions of best practices that multinationals have adopted in the U.S. since 2002. The third bullet here is lesser known, I think, amongst the general public, but actually since 1991, the Civil Rights Act overseeing multinationals, the Civil Rights Act of 1991 and the amendments in there have actually sought to ensure that Title VII and the Americans with Disabilities Act extend to American citizens working overseas for American employers. So what that means is to date, many of you and many of your companies have actually been held accountable under the Civil Rights Act for non-discrimination taking place beyond the U.S. borders. And so what we're looking at here is both a natural extension of the decision to invest in LGBT inclusion, but also a natural extension in terms of where businesses have been over the last 20 years, 25 years almost, in terms of ensuring that these codes of conduct, that these expectations around non-discrimination in the workplace apply wherever they are doing business to U.S. citizens. Now, certainly most businesses don't have a cutoff where they say U.S. citizens must abide by this policy and non-U.S. citizens abide by that. So what we're actually seeing is a real globalization of basic principles of non-discrimination in the workplace. Also, in terms of, what is the furthermore, sort of what is the business case here, there are some key points in terms of why businesses, if they haven't done so already, would want to very clearly extend these employment protections across state lines but also internationally. And it really is sort of the same rationale that we see stateside. You want to mitigate risk. With a mobile workforce, you don't want some managers having one understanding or perhaps even a limited understanding of non-discrimination in the workplace, have them move to the States or move from the States to another location, and frankly just not understand that at this company everyone is welcome and everyone is going to be judged on the merits of their work and not irrelevant factors like their sexual orientation or gender identity. Furthermore, there's really not a part of the world where there's not a viable LGBT and broader sort of coalition of an equality movement. And by having these principles in place globally, you're also ensuring consistency in brand and corporate reputation. And what we're seeing over and over again, and particularly over the last several years, is that this is a consumer market and an employee pool that is watching this. And, with the, entry of a blog and the click of a mouse, the conversation around LGBT inclusion in Russia travels quite quickly. Or the conversation about how a company is behaving in Jamaica or in Nigeria, all of these are traveling so quickly that it really does behoove multinational businesses to enshrine into policy clear, explicit protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And so what we have next, on this next slide, is an example given to us with permission. It is publicly available from Coca-Cola. And so, there's not a lot of fanfare, if you will, around this. This is a fairly straightforward declaration of Coca-Cola's values when it comes to a workplace environment that's free from discrimination. And you'll see in here specific language that includes categories that are often seen in these statements, such as age, religion, color, disability. You also see on there sexual orientation, gender identity, and or expression clearly articulated as protected categories at Coca-Cola. And then the next example from banking and financial services, again given to us with permission but also publicly available, is from Citigroup, a company that's operating in dozens of countries. And again, you see almost mirror images of the language in here. And Citigroup, because of their huge global reach, and to dispel the idea that companies operating in seemingly hostile environments cannot also uphold their own principles of inclusion and non-discrimination. And so even with the tragic and dramatic headlines that we've seen in the last few years from the likes of Uganda, Nigeria, Russia, prohibitions or a legal environment that is hostile to certain, homosexual acts is not tantamount to a prohibition on having your own workforce inclusion policies. they really are not, they can be mutually exclusive. In other words, you can be in a legally hostile environment with regard to same-sex relations, but also at the same time, as a private employer, uphold your own standards with exactly how employees will be evaluated in terms of hiring, firing, and promotional practices. And so with that, we're just going to take a second and have a quick poll here, and I think Pat Bailey's going to lead us in that.
I will. And so here's an opportunity to look at where your company is. And the question is, my company will score 100% on the new 2016 Global Workplace Non-Discrimination Policy and or Code of Conduct. So your choices are: you strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, or not applicable. Just hit submit after you voted, and you'll get the graph that will come up. And again, we've had a lot of companies that came at 100%. That was about 60%. We're up to about 125 callers right now. So we see at least half to two-thirds of that 60% are now saying yes, they strongly agree. They're going to have that global policy. Good high numbers on agree, about 26.1. We've got a small, about 17, 18% that's not applicable to. And then we've got a few companies that are still working on that. They disagree. And I just had a question that came in from Jennifer, Dina, about what does code of conduct mean? I mean, and what that.
Sure. So thanks, Pat, and thanks, Jennifer. So some businesses don't have an employee code of conduct that's separate from their EEO statement. In other words, when you're looking at a job application, when you're handed the HR policies upon your onboarding process, you'll see a very clear statement of non-discrimination. Other businesses may have both. They may have their EEO statement, but also a code of conduct that further elaborates expectations of employee behavior. Often you'll see statements in these employee codes, international employee codes of conduct that speak to ethics issues, child labor, environmental issues. So you see sort of a wider swath typically in these corporate codes of conduct that really speak to broader corporate citizenship. The reason why we say a non-discrimination policy and or code of conduct is because for some businesses it's not just a matter of semantics. And that's not so much about an LGBT issue, but rather a sensitivity within the business to not be overly U.S.-centric in tone or language, but to still have a platform where they can communicate out their own clear expectations of behavior with regard to non-discrimination on the basis of both gender identity and sexual orientation.
Great, good answer. So we've got about two-thirds of the folks have voted. So it looks like we've got a good solid 60%. 35% strongly agree, but we've got a good chunk that agree, so making good progress on that. So what's the next topic that's up for us?
So thank you so much. And I would just suggest for those that indicated that they don't agree, please do reach out to us, because if you're having particular challenges or you know that your management, leadership, HR team is having particular challenges, we still have a window to work together. So please do reach out to us at cei@hrc.org. And so the next one has to do with giving standards. Now, when we talk about giving standards, we are talking about centralized corporate philanthropy, including corporate foundational giving. And the reason why we have articulated this, the catalyst for it was the Boy Scouts, and so we'll talk about that momentarily. But it actually cracked open a broader conversation that, boiled down to how can a company be earning a 100% on the Corporate Equality Index, but giving significant amounts of money and resources to a group that openly discriminates against the LGBT community. And so while the Boy Scouts policy didn't actually change substantially from the early 2000s until this blow-up about 2 summers ago, so prior to the Scout allowance, what had changed is that the overall atmosphere of corporate America, of out LGBT employees and out allies, people who said, look, there are plenty of other organizations that are worthy of our time and resources that don't discriminate. So that's really where we saw this significant shift. And so by making sure that major philanthropic efforts are not geared towards secular organizations, and secular is an optimal word here, secular organizations that discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, you are further establishing consistency in your values and in your principles across significant operations. What we saw with the Boy Scouts blow up is that people are watching, and they're with all of the gains and victories of the last couple of years, there's generally less tolerance for major inconsistencies when it comes to a 100% or a top-rated business looking at their behavior across the board. So again, for those wanting to know specifics here, we are talking about centralized significant philanthropic donations and activities, so that includes in-kind donations, pro bono work, employee volunteer hours, matching gift programs. And what we are looking for is not an audit of who you give money to, but within your own vetting process, do you have guidelines articulating what organizations can and cannot receive your corporate funding? I'm seeing some questions come in, so just bear with me 1 second. I'll run through this material to walk us through exactly how we got here. So as I had alluded to, the Boy Scouts essentially doubled down on their longstanding policy of discriminating against gay people. And I say that broadly because at the time, one could not be gay or openly gay and a Boy Scout, a leader at the organization, or an employee. And so what happened is you saw significant community and corporate responses. And so we have a couple of examples here of businesses that actually pulled their funding. You see a very strong statement from Caterpillar explaining that they do not invest with the Boy Scouts of America due to their non-discrimination policy not conforming with ours. By not investing with this organization due to their policies, it shows our employees and the world that we will not support this type of discrimination. And so this is a key response, in the words of Caterpillar and in others, not only to the media and sort of the broader community outlook when it came to the Boy Scouts, but also the internal voices, employees saying, hey, I'm proud to work for this company, but the idea that you would be giving significant having significant charitable contributions to a group that wouldn't even allow me to bring my own kid on a camping trip, that's just not right. And so that's really how you've seen dozens of major companies rescind funding. And it goes beyond this couple of examples on here, including UPS, Disney, and a number of others. Now, when we talk about giving standards, this is probably the least exciting, if you will, or snazzy of the slides that you'll see, but this is what a corporate grants policy can look like. We've highlighted the sections that articulate organizations that, for example, the Levi Strauss Foundation will not support. And so these are organizations that permit discrimination against a person or group on the basis of HIV/AIDS status, religious belief, gender identity, sexual orientation, and so forth. So for those already starting to ask questions, this is what we will be asking for and have asked for in the Corporate Equality Index. We're looking for a copy of your giving standards statement. We're not looking for an audit of who's receiving your corporate funding. And so with that, Pat, I think it makes sense to quickly look at some of these questions before we get into a poll.
Definitely, and I think Christopher sent one in. It says, for the giving standards, is there going to be a list of organization of bad actors for secular organizations? Are you that, although you're not keeping an audit by company, do you have some suggestions or ideas of beyond the Boy Scouts who that might be?
Yeah, so from a national standpoint, the Boy Scouts really are the most prominent. We will not and generally do not release lists of organizations that we consider bad. Going back to the overall framing of the Corporate Equality Index, we don't want to be the one-off policing agent, but rather we seek to affect broader institutional change. And this is really beyond just the language on the piece of paper in terms of a giving standard. It's our hope that what this is really doing is putting into practice a dialogue between major corporations and recipients of their funding. And so we are leaving it to our companies to engage with these organizations to ensure that they do not uphold a practice or a policy of discriminating against the LGBT community. And so that's sort of the difference between the one-off, is there a list of 10 organizations that are really problematic, and, how are we truly transforming the lens through which major businesses are viewing organizations that they support.
Right, and Michael made a comment about that they may not know if there's any unwritten practices, but I can also see this as an opportunity to talk to your foundation or your grant folks for the ERG members to do research and say, hey, we're giving to these folks, do you know their policies? And then that one step further where you can say, well, let's think about this, and let's make sure it's part of the criteria when we ask who's signing up for that.
Definitely. And so looking at some of the other questions,
Marcus
in
has
the corporate.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, jump in.
Just real quick, so we will be asking again for a copy of that giving policy. We do have in our FAQs in the downloadable toolkit the question about the United Way, and so we're not attempting to follow the money 2 and 3 degrees from the company. Certainly, if you know that you're giving to United Way and that there's still significant amounts of money going to Boy Scouts, if that's something that you want to have your company wants to have a conversation with United Way about, we support that. However, we're not going to dock points for businesses that give to the United Way. Lastly, in terms of semantics, what we're looking for is language that ensures company money is not flowing to organizations that discriminate against one part of or all of the LGBT community. So somebody was asking about the and/or question. Depends on exactly how it's written, but the intent is what matters and the effect is what matters. So as long as you have language that prohibits funding from reaching organizations that openly discriminate against some or all of the LGBT community, then that prohibition on the corporate giving works for us.
Right, and somebody mentioned, for example, like Chick-fil-A as a company, but also I just saw that Exxon has now said that they'll support and protect their employees. So again, that kind of strength-based being positive, that there's always hope and changing kind of moving forward is a great thing. Brian made a comment talking about kind of how do you do that when the company gets 100%, but there's still issues that they see inside. Any suggestions about how internally they can make up to a higher visible level?
Right, and so this sounds like an issue that's not unique to the giving standards question, but really, how do you make that 100% a consistent experience across the business? And at the risk of plugging another one of our projects, and it's certainly something that we've worked with Out and Equal on, is sort of the notion of workplace climate. And how can you get beyond just the policies and benefits in place to an everyday practice of inclusion? And so I would encourage folks to read through our national study called The Cost of the Closet and the Rewards of Inclusion. And from there, we also have tips about how to actually begin this conversation as Brian notes in sort of the smaller, more conservative plants and communities, so that you really are demonstrating this is a corporate value and here's how we actually make that real. So if a smaller business unit, a smaller office or plant is deciding how to spend their volunteer hours, then we can work with you on how to frame this so that you can both uphold the standards with respect to Boy Scouts or any other group that discriminates, but also respect the local culture and dialogue happening on the ground.
Definitely. We're getting some great conversation that's going on there. A little bit more about the United Way and how that works, because I know if I individually want to give, that's one thing, but the United Way, you don't necessarily have a driver about who they support. So how do you kind of balance that one out?
Yeah, so, we encourage dialogue between major corporations and groups like the United Way. For purposes of the Corporate Equality Index 2016 scorecard, we will not be docking points for the United Way. We're looking at direct contributions between a company or its foundation and secular nonprofits receiving their funds, and whether or not the company upholds corporate giving standards that prohibit discrimination against some or all of the LGBT community.
Right. Brian asked a question about, so looking we're kind of jumping back to the non-global non-discrimination policies. What's the scoring? How do you get points for this? You say, that you can work with them. Is there kind of a guideline that says, well, you're getting there? I know we did that with transgender health benefits and things like that. How's that philosophy going to kind of move forward this year?
Well, so for those businesses that are operating globally but differentiate when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity protections, if that company differentiates between, well, we'll protect that stateside but not elsewhere, then the company will lose points. The exact point number, we're not ready to announce just yet. We're on the heels of that, so stay tuned. But questions that I'm seeing come up in terms of, for example, Exxon. So ExxonMobil did just last week, if you saw in the news that certainly we were in, they did update their policy, but they were very specific that it's U.S. only. And it certainly is aimed at the federal contract procurement process and abiding by regulations under the executive order. So, Exxon would not be meeting the 2016 criteria based on today's facts. I hope that changes. But certainly the expectation here is that non-discrimination, that these principles are extended beyond the U.S. to wherever the company does business.
Right. And is there any criteria difference based on what the country laws are? I mean, I know the State Department is doing a lot of, we don't care where we are, we're going to do that, and several other companies are doing that. But is there a difference in terms of if I'm in a hostile country versus a neutral country? Is that going to make a difference, how you kind of look at that?
No, we're not doing a tiered system, because what we are seeing from the firsthand accounts of the likes of Google and IBM and others is that their principles of non-discrimination are unequivocal, from the legally or culturally hostile environments to some of the more welcoming. And, to some degree, you could actually say the same thing about domestic policy. There are certainly whole swaths of the United States that are decidedly less friendly to the LGBT community from a legal standpoint, maybe even from a cultural standpoint. But that doesn't mean that businesses have created carve-outs for, well, we'll play by these rules where it's friendly and easier, and we'll play by a different set of rules where it gets harder. So again, from a business standpoint, from a risk mitigation and consistency standpoint, that just doesn't make sense. But most importantly, what we have seen in terms of tracking this data over time, and certainly, again, hearing the firsthand accounts from companies at the Out and Equal Summit, in terms of their dialogue with HRC, they're telling us, look, it just makes good business sense for us to have one unequivocal set of standards that applies wherever we do business.
That's great, and that's a good example about the U.S., and that's a good review. So with all this discussion, I think we've got most of the comments and questions kind of answered. Let's do another poll with everybody. So now, looking at going back to the corporate giving guidelines rather than the global policy, how's your company going to do this year on that? So go ahead and submit your answer if you think you'll get 100% on the giving criteria, or if that's an area that you need to look at a little bit more or not sure on that. Again, I think it's a great opportunity for the ERG to be talking to their foundation and their giving parts of their organizations and having that discussion to say, where's the money going? Do we get a voice in that? How can you be that additional voice that can help individuals and corporations make the right decisions, instead of putting out something publicly and then having to deal with the repercussions of, oops, wrong choice. So And it looks like we've got, let's see, we're up still about 120 on the call. So it looks like neutral about is the largest, 30%. We've got some agree, 28.8, strongly agree about 21, disagree 6.1, strongly disagree 2.4, and about 11% who are not applicable. I did see a question come in from Rosemarie about the criteria and how they're weighted. Looks like kind of a bigger question about how the CEI works in the weighting. Maybe you can mention the points for these new criteria if you've got those, Dina.
Yes, so actually we're not ready to announce the exact point allocation just yet, but I was saying before, just stay tuned for that, and we'll release those and also the mock-up scorecard for all of our businesses.
Okay, great. And then one more question related to giving. Cynthia asked about what about corporate gift matching? How does that work? That's all. I know you mentioned that already, but just to be clear that kind of falls under this too.
Yeah, so corporate gift matching does count here because, again, there is a process sometimes handled by a third-party administrator, but there is a process by which businesses vet qualifying organizations for employee match contributions, for direct contributions, and so we are trying to get to that core set of guidance that the company is giving across all major philanthropic efforts.
Right. So it's not just as simple as checking off the list that they're a 501c3 company.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. It looks like we have a couple more discussions going on here. So let's go ahead and get to the next criteria, which I think is supplier standards. So.
Okay. Okay, and so when we're looking at supplier standards, here's the rationale. Again, to a large extent, this reflects not only what companies are already doing, but also good common sense. In today's, for many people, their workplace may in fact have, several employers operating at once and together. And so having major contracts articulate expectations around non-discrimination with respect to sexual orientation and gender identity just makes good business sense from a safety and inclusion perspective and a risk mitigation perspective. Our new standard does not require your vendors or contractors to create their own non-discrimination policy, but to abide by yours, presuming yours is inclusive. If it's not, then you would not get credit there. It does not directly impact supplier diversity programs, and it also does not apply to one-time vendors. So again, we're talking about Tier 1, the major contracts. And just here's a quick sample of what we consider a great practice. So this is from AT&T, and this is a clear statement of their expectations of suppliers. And so that includes prohibition on employment, wage and benefits practices being based on grounds of color, race, caste, status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so forth.
Excellent. And so have we been helped with President Obama's executive order on this? Have you seen more of a push of companies? I know they're going to meet the minimum criteria by including sexual orientation and gender identity, but are you getting some inquiries from other sectors in business you haven't heard from before?
Yeah, I think so. The tone set by this executive order was, the specific inclusion of gender identity and sexual orientation protections matters when it comes to these large-scale contracts. And so while the executive order does not filter down to this level of criteria when we're talking about business-to-business contracts, it certainly is the catalyst for major changes like we just saw at ExxonMobil. But what I think you're seeing more broadly from a regulatory and also a sort of broader corporate citizenship standpoint is an expectation that, hey, if you're going to do business with us, we have some very core principles of non-discrimination that we expect you to abide by and that we will articulate as part of that RFP process.
Got it. And this is, and again, for folks to remember this, I mean, I think there's two parts to this. There's obviously that the companies that, supply you and you're a contractor with, should have it. But then also to think about including in your supplier diversity LGBT-owned organizations. Well. And so, okay, so let's do one more poll here, and then we'll kind of get into the general discussion about this a little bit. It talks about my company will score 100% on the new 2016 inclusive non-discrimination requirements for contractors and vendors. So again, select your answer and hit submit on that. And we've got strongly agree at about 27%. Looks like agree or neutral are running about the same, about 30. Well, let's see, there's a bigger jump now. About 40% are neutral on this one, and about 25% agree. That strongly agree with. What's the best way to check this? How have you, Dina, asked companies to? How do they check this and verify it and figure out if it's happening or not?
So actually for a few years we've included a question in the Corporate Equality Index survey. And to date about 2/3 of our businesses have consistently indicated that they do ask all major suppliers and contractors to abide by their non-discrimination policy. And so we ask the question, and then of course companies like AT&T submit those substantiating documents.
Okay,
so again, you'll see that across these three criteria, the corporate giving guidelines, the supplier expectations, and the global non-discrimination language, it's all virtually the same, because what we're looking for is setting that standard across business operations that unequivocally states gender identity and sexual orientation are protected categories, and that a business will not engage in significant transactions or in significant philanthropy or employment practices with anyone or any entity that does not abide by that principle of non-discrimination.
Got it. A couple kind of general comments. One was talking about supplier diversity. Have you talked with any of the government agencies yet, or worked with any of them who are starting to look for more of the supplier diversity? Not they're required by the executive order that companies have protections, but have you seen anybody start to reach out for companies that are LGBT owned?
Oh, certainly, and that's something that we've seen a steady increase when it comes to LGBT-owned businesses in diverse supply chains, and we've seen that steadily increase over the last several years, and we're seeing more companies submit that for credit in their public commitment. And so for the exact data points on that, I know NGLCC would be the right source for growth over the last couple of years, but again, I think what you're seeing broadly is that wherever corporations are having the discussion about what qualifies for a diverse and inclusive supply chain, talent pool, market segment, that if they're not including LGBT alongside other traditional categories, then they're behind the curve, and it's something that they're going to change.
Excellent. And so, again, you kind of mentioned it as we've gone through that, but can you kind of summarize what the new requirements and what the companies need to provide as evidence in those when they submit this year?
Absolutely. And so just as every year businesses indicate to us if they include gender identity and sexual orientation protections in their U.S. EEO policy, we are going to ask if that policy is in fact global. If it is not global, we have questions as to why, or does it apply in limited locations. And we will also ask for the attachment of that exact language. For those businesses that say, well, we've got our U.S. EEO statement, here's our code of conduct that applies globally that includes LGBT protections, then that's perfectly fine. In terms of the corporate giving guidelines, we are asking the question and also asking for a scan of those actual corporate giving guidelines. And we have numerous examples of corporate giving guidelines that we can certainly share. The best first stop for this information is that downloadable toolkit at hrc.org/2016 CEI. And lastly, when it comes to Tier 1, so major suppliers, you want to get in touch with whoever oversees your procurement process and check out whether or not you have articulated expectations of major suppliers. And again, you'll find that by and large, most major companies have this function in place. They have the paperwork in place, and simply it's a matter of adding the specific language around sexual orientation and gender identity to existing documents.
Sounds good. Scott had a question kind of jumping back to one of the organizational competency parts about talking about self-ID. Are you seeing any backlash or pushback from employees? I mean, it's an initiative that, we've worked on with the community of practice on self-ID, and, we've pushed that really, really hard. I'm hearing some discussions going on the global scale, again, with privacy issues and things like that. Are we going to see down the line that a lot of the other criteria are going to go global as well? And are you hearing anything about those discussions, especially around self-ID?
Yeah, and so self-identification, there are models of how businesses are reconciling the differing laws. For example, Europe has some strict prohibitions on that data collection. At present, we're not grading on the globalization of the self-ID initiatives, but I think what we're seeing largely is that businesses are still trying to get their arms around the benefits of having these self-ID practices. They're finally starting to use the data. Even the trailblazers that were featured in that initial collaborative report Without an Equal, I think are still in a process of better understanding how they can leverage that information, whether it's to more refine their recruitment practices, whether it's to better track exactly how their LGBT workforce is retained and sort of what the trajectories of their careers look like. So you're just seeing, I think, we're a couple years from a very solid understanding of true models of consistent best practices and longitudinal information about the self-ID of LGBT workers.
Right.
But I would also defer to Pat, too, because you certainly certainly are in constant dialogue with many of the same employers if you have a different opinion.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that we've done fairly well. I mean, the Federal Viewpoint Survey and their strategy of rolling out demographics asking about, do you have a disability, are you a veteran, are you LGBT, was amazing, and it's really helped a lot of companies because of the new reporting requirements for both veterans and for around disabilities. It's helped them make that argument to begin, at least on the survey level, to start to ask the questions. And we're seeing more companies start to pick up, the HR records and actually tracking individuals through the company. But again, what I keep seeing is, as you said, I don't see a lot of tangible, here's how we're using this, and here's the changes that we've made. And just like if you want to retain women in the company, you should be able to see over a course of a number of years changes in your programs that retain the top women. We should be starting to see that work. But I think, again, the numbers are still small, and one of the areas I've been asking about is let's bring allies into this discussion. I have a theory that if you asked about, do you know someone in the workplace who is LGBT and out, and let's say the company average is 70%, and suddenly you find one pocket that there's only 30%, I know someone who's out. My bet is there's probably some climate issues there that you can discuss. And it creates a much larger number of people who are connected to LGBT employees than we've seen. So yeah, lots going on. So.
Mm-hmm.
And I put the word out with any other questions. I know Scott's kind of addressing back here, talking about kind of the self-ID and some folks still being very hesitant to being out, until we get federal protections, until we have global protections. It's not safe necessarily if I'm going to transfer from here to some other state that doesn't protect me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly the national picture that we found in the cost of the closet is that roughly half of the LGBT workforce in this country remains essentially closeted on the job or open to just a few colleagues. And so, there is a distinction between being open about your orientation, your gender identity to colleagues in a day-to-day sense, and how comfortable you would be filling out a confidential or an anonymous survey. But certainly the overall climate is still changing for LGBT employees. And so what we often tell businesses looking to wade into self-ID is that you really need to have the long view in terms of building up trust in this process, in terms of communicating with your entire workforce as to why you're asking this question, what you'll do with that information. And what we find is that over time, often businesses will see a growth in the number of self-identified LGBT employees, but we sometimes joke that that doesn't necessarily mean a net increase of LGBT employees coming in the door. It actually is indicative of LGBT folks feeling more comfortable to self-select and not opting out of surveys or ignoring the question.
Right, because that satisfaction piece is still there. A couple of good comments about, Michael asked about extra credit. I was thinking about the Arizona watching the Super Bowl this weekend, that, you know, how those businesses and companies there stood up so strongly when the Don't Serve the Gay bills were there, even to the point of pulling the Super Bowl. So is there going to be still that kind of, if you're doing something that really stands out, negative points, or are there any chance for extra credits?
You know, we are sometimes asked about extra credit, but no, we're not looking at an extra credit model right now. We certainly agree that there are these outstanding public policy efforts, and there are ways that we can leverage company stories. You know, we certainly have a new series coming out called The Look Forward, in which we will be combining both best practice sharing, but also those firsthand accounts of what did it mean for our company to first weigh in on marriage, or to first weigh in on a gender identity inclusive non-discrimination bill. But having said that, you know, we don't want to put a different sort of value on public policy than we are the other aspects of the Corporate Equality Index, and so we're sticking with that straightforward scorecard for clarity's sake, but also because there really are a number of ways that this can demonstrate that they're outstanding. Another area that is worthy of attention and research, and it's something that we're working on, is that businesses, we don't have many in hand. In fact, we have very few, but businesses can become better or even best in class when it comes to holistic transgender inclusive healthcare coverage. And so you'll note that earlier I used the term baseline coverage of care. That's because the current standard reflects the market norms, what the insurance companies are packaging up in their products to major businesses, where businesses have gone in terms of the farthest reaching with regard to transgender inclusive medical coverage. But that's certainly an area where there's room for growth. And what I mean by that specifically is, you know, we want to elevate that core set of trailblazers for transgender health that are moving forward not only with baseline coverage, with SRS coverage and hormone therapy coverage, but also with things like facial feminization, with vocal cord therapies, and other procedures that are commonly excluded in commercially available insurance products. So I digress a little bit there just to say that that is very much on our radar. We have research and resources devoted to it. And when we can build out that solid foundation of a critical mass, most certainly you should expect forthcoming changes in that area. But to date, I would just ask that individuals reach out to us if they are interested in better expanding their current transgender healthcare offerings.
Definitely, yeah, that's a good point, because that's changing. Donald asked a question about, you know, looking at the states and rating them in terms of, I know the Southern Strategy discussion that's kind of going on, that's kind of the buzzword right now, you know, in terms of, you know, how do we organize all the communities, including the business communities, to raise their voices like they did in Arizona. And I know I talked, probably about 5 years back, we talked with the government about creating kind of a government equality index. Is there anything that's on the horizon or that you've heard about? How do you rate states and federal and local governments on how they're doing?
Oh, well, actually, we just released the inaugural State Equality Index. I have an incredible colleague named Allison Gill, who's been around the movement for some time. And so that's just at hrc.org/FEI. And that was done in collaboration with HRC and the Equality Federation of the various state equality groups. So that gives you a really good view of the LGBT friendliness of individual states. And then drilling down even further, we have the MEI, so the Municipal Equality Index, which again would just be at hrc.org/MEI. We sometimes joke that if you give us a challenge, we'll give you an index, but it has proved to be an effective strategy for evaluating and also leading change across these different public and private sector entities.
Right. It looks like we're getting a couple more questions coming in. One of the questions that's come up several times is about a copy of the presentation will be made available. We will send the slides out and a link to this recording with a follow-up message, so you should see that in the next day or so. And over on the right-hand column will be a link and the slides to get that. And then there's another question looking at kind of the call-outs. Craig mentioned about that we were not talking about race and gender, but that's because those are protected in a lot of these situations. And this is the requirement to call out sexual orientation and gender identity is more about filling in the gaps that aren't in that mandated protected class.
Exactly.
Obviously still issues that Marisha has a good question about how any results on how companies' CEI score relates to their financial performance?
Yeah, so in evaluating financial performance, there's never one single predictor variable, if you will. And what we do see overall, though, is that the higher you are, the more selective you get with, for example, looking at Fortune 500 data cuts, the more likely and the stronger the correlation between the number on the Fortune list and the extent to which a business is engaged in LGBT issues. So you can solidly say that the vast majority of the most prosperous businesses in this country are engaged on LGBT inclusion. Many of them are highly scored on the CEI. And I know that some institutions, namely Credit Suisse, has an actual investment index based on CEI scores. So I think we're still looking at what a few years' worth of data can demonstrate for us. But certainly it is a key factor in the viability of a company.
Yeah, and I know there's been some studies that have been done in Europe looking at, getting women and gender parity at the C-suite, that those companies are outperforming those that don't have gender parity. So at least there's a start of that kind of research going on, but it'll probably take a few years for that to come down to LGBT. We have to get those out CEOs talking some more before we kind of can take a look at the overall company as well as the employees. Let's see. It looks like, and Ingrid came up with a great suggestion, and now you're kind of reaching that, 10-year plus point with companies at 100%. Any thoughts about doing some other distinction or recognition for those folks about how those companies doing so well for so long?
Certainly, and we're always open to suggestions as to specifically what that would look like. We do with our various rollouts of the CEI and in different speaking engagements and in different platforms, name some of our longest running companies. But also it's important to note that certainly some of the businesses that have scored a 100 on the CEI were in their infancy even a decade ago. I mean, I'm looking at companies like Facebook and other businesses that only recently had an IPO and sort of came together as being large enough for a CEI score. So I think that we at HRC absolutely commend and love to tell the stories of some of our longest running top scorers. And then we also commend those businesses that had a genuine change of heart at the leadership level and really turned around and implemented LGBT inclusive policies, or those that as a new business really saw that, as part of growing from a startup to a publicly traded business, that LGBT inclusion was central to their overall business strategy. So having said that, I definitely welcome folks' thoughts, whether, you're thinking of a particular logo or a particular award designation for those long-running businesses. Again, getting in touch with us at CEI@hrc.org.
Great, sounds good. Also, thinking about, as you mentioned that, we're getting more and more kind of out of the Fortune 1000 companies, so we're starting to talk at mid-sized and small companies, who look at those criteria and go, the basics are good, and I can use that as a guideline, but, I would never apply for this because I could never meet the criteria all the way through. Are you getting some of those same kind of questions from smaller companies?
We are. We definitely are. And, it really can be, there are certainly some similarities, and I think we've both done work with the Small Business Administration. HRC is rolling out the Equality is Our Business campaign in states like Mississippi and Alabama that don't have as much of a large business network. And so small businesses that, to date have not had to or, currently don't have an official non-discrimination policy are still seeking ways to demonstrate their support for equality in the workplace and equality within the greater communities that they serve and operate. So we're definitely seeing interest across the board.
Definitely. And Dana asked a good question about, even with a company with 100, again, that kind of climate piece and looking specifically at transgender employees and how we kind of do that and address that scoring of that issue. And we've talked a little bit about, self-ID already, but I know that climate piece is a much harder way to measure. Have you made any advances in that area about what might be next?
Well, yeah. So, before something can be in the Corporate Equality Index, it does need to be standardized. And so, we have what we think is an effective set of climate questions that's been road tested not only as national polls, but also as pilot programs within several major Fortune companies. So I would definitely urge folks to get in touch with us, CEI@hrc.org, to talk about ways that we can work with your company to roll out these LGBT climate questions to better get our arms around, how far does this policy reach into the everyday experiences of the LGBT workforce?
Sounds good. We've got a couple of other comments and questions that are getting more specific, but I think I want to keep an eye on time here. So why don't we roll it back and let you make your kind of closing comments. And if folks do have more questions, Dina will be available, and I'll chat out her email address, and you can kind of take some of those more precise questions up with her individually and get a much more in-depth answer.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you again to everybody for joining. Thank you to Out and Equal for your continued partnership on this. A couple of just quick closing statements here. Again, we are always available at CEI@hrc.org. In terms of what do I do now, what are my next steps, if you took out a quick checklist and said, I think we're good on the global non-discrim, I think we're good on the supplier standards, but I don't know about our philanthropy, you want to get in touch with us, want to get in touch with the right person or team within your company, and we can work directly to ensure that there are no surprises when it comes to the actual CEI survey on April 1st. But beyond that, I know that some of the questions and comments did get a bit beyond just the CEI, and I encourage that. And I want to just also add that, as funny as this sounds, coming from the index people, the index is not the absolute alpha and omega of LGBT equality and inclusion. So please let us know about other issues that are emerging for you, other potential areas of focus, and we have a myriad ways that we can address them, from direct contact with businesses to our new webinar series to look forward to events and earned media. So please keep the commentary coming. It may not be an immediate translation to the Corporate Equality Index, but certainly worthy of our attention and collaboration. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Sounds great, and thank you, Dina, for all your expertise and the hard work on this and really getting the information out. I think the rollout has been so amazing on these, is that, trying to make these changes happen at the corporate level is not an easy thing to do. It doesn't just happen in one day, and your work has really made a difference overall within the movement and then specifically within the workplace. And I want to thank all of you for your participation and great comments and questions that have come in. When we end this call, there'll be a short survey, so go ahead and put your feedback in and let us know what other topics. We'll be back next week on Tuesday, February 10th, for PepsiCo's presentation about Pledge Week proven ideas to jumpstart your ally program. As always, if you can consider supporting Out and Equal, we would appreciate that. We hope you can join us in Dallas. And again, thank you very much for everybody, and we will talk to you next week.